So as we've mentioned before, the biological species concept classifies members of the same species as those who can interbreed naturally and produce viable and fertile offspring. And viable means able to survive, and fertile meaning able to reproduce themselves. So when we produce a viable offspring, but one that is not fertile, recall that we call that individual a hybrid. If organisms potentially could interbreed but do not do so because of geography or habitat, then we consider them reproductively isolated. So let's take a look at these species of meadowlark. To an untrained eye, they probably would look like the exact same birds, and especially if you saw them out of their context. It turns out they are different species because they cannot interbreed in nature for two reasons. One is habitat. The western meadowlark is in the western U.S. and the eastern meadowlark is in the eastern U.S., so they would never encounter each other in the modern era. Furthermore, the mating calls are different enough that even if they were in the same spot, they would not be able to attract females of the opposite species because the mating call would be unrecognized by the individual from the other species. So, in conclusion, reproductive isolation is extremely important when we talk about speciation. There are pre-zygotic barriers and post-zygotic barriers. So remember that a zygote is the fused gametes that occur during fertilization. So pre-zygotic barriers are ones that occur before fertilization, and post-zygotic barriers are ones that occur after fertilization. The biological species concept is not the only concept that we talk about, although it is the most frequently used, especially when we're talking about sexually reproducing organisms. In the case of asexually reproducing organisms, some of these other species concepts may work to serve scientists and conservationists more efficiently. So the phylogenetic species concept is one based on genetics. So you can remind yourself of that because genetic is right there in the species concept name. So genetics are used to determine whether populations share a common ancestor, and if they do, we call this a monophyletic group or clade. Remember to keep an eye on your word roots here. The morphological species concept is based on physical characteristics, and we've definitely talked about morphology before when we're discussing phenotype. So in the morphological species concept, the phenotype is very important, with the genetic type, the genotype being less important. Finally, the ecological species concept brings a lot of information to play regarding the organism's niche in the environment. And Darwin's finches would be a good example of this. We saw that there were many species of finches living in one geographic area, and although they are quite similar, they do not exploit the same habitats or food sources, which are major components to the niche. Now we can look at examples where we consider species or consider different organisms to be different species, but they are technically the same species. So in the phylogeny of domesticated dogs, we see that the ancestor was a wolf, and then we had different breeds of dogs developing through selective breeding over time and many generations. And so although domestic and artificial selection can lead to considerable morphological diversity within the same species, you can imagine that there might be some post-zygotic barriers with regard to the morphology of these various breeds. Looking at it from a different perspective, one of conservation biology, conservation biologists are chiefly concerned with the preservation of species and biodiversity. In the case of right whales, which were originally considered all one species, we found that increased understanding of the genetic differences can lead to protection of some species, and that is better than the condition that would result from all of these whales being considered one species, since they exploit an international habitat. You can imagine that transboundary politics play into this conservation biology story. So in summary, in this module, you will learn about the definition of the biological species concept and list alternate species concepts. You'll also consider the role of reproductive isolation in the evolution of species and understand that there are barriers that occur before fertilization and after fertilization. Okay, so let's take a look at geographic factors in speciation, so building on these reproductive barriers that we already discussed. Here's our vocabulary for the module. Okay, so let's take a look at geographic factors in speciation. There are two kinds of speciation, allopatric and sympatric speciation. So when we look at our word roots, we see allo, meaning other, patric, meaning country. And in sympatric, we have previously defined sim as together, and in your module you'll read it defined as one, so one country speciation. So in allopatric speciation occurs after geographic separation. So one population was separated from natural disaster or creation of new geologic features, for example, that separate the species. Now we see also, but far less frequently, sympatric speciation, when individuals of the same species over time exploit different niches within a specific habitat, to the point where they no longer interact reproductively for reasons that are not genetically oriented or biologically oriented, but have more to do with temporal factors and or factors of habitat exploitation. So let's take a look at this palm. In the case of this palm, there are two species living in the same area, and one prefers one substrate of soil, volcanic soils, and the other prefers calcareous soils. Furthermore, they are temporally separated, although exploiting the same geographic area. They are temporally separated because they do not flower at the same time. Therefore, their pollen is not interchanged. And so over time, these palms have become distinct species. So there are various other factors that we'll discuss here. So the last one is polyploidy, and that's the failure of the chromosomes to separate during meiosis. So one example you can keep in your mind is that we talked about meiosis and how meiosis too is a process by which diploid cells become haploid cells. They reduce their chromosome number by half. In the case of polyploidy, the chromosomes fail to separate during meiosis, and this would lead to prezygotic barriers, because when those gametes go to fuse in fertilization with other gametes, there are not the correct number of chromosomes, and therefore failure occurs. As I just mentioned, mate choice is an example of how sympatric speciation occurs. In the palm, I was talking about how the pollen is not released at the same time, but we also see other examples. For example, the cichlid, a fish, that preferentially mates with fish that have very similar coloring to it, although the coloring across the species can be quite variable. And then finally, we talked about small-scale geographic segregation, like in the case of the finches, how some finches feed on the ground and some feed in different canopy layers of the overstory. Now let's take a look at plants again for just 1 second. Plants can do all sorts of neat stuff because in most cases plants can reproduce sexually and asexually. So this failure to separate chromosomes during meiosis doesn't necessarily lead in a failure of fitness. Instead, we find that we can have a failure of separation of chromosomes, and then that plant could persist as a separate species, as a polyploid, and continue to reproduce asexually. Alternatively, polyploids can reproduce sexually with each other if they are in close proximity to each other. So let's take a closer look at the errors in meiosis that can lead to autopolyploidy. So on the left side here, we see that we have the first division, and there's non-disjunction. So as we go into meiosis 2, we're continuing to produce gametes that have more than one set of genetic information. And then in the case over here, we see that there's non-disjunction, and it results in a different outcome in the gametes, but likewise results in some frequency of gametes that are not haploid. If there are 3 sets of chromosomes, it's called trisomic, 1 set monosomic, and 2 sets disomic. Okay, in this module we talked about how speciation might occur within the same geographic area or beyond, or as a result of geographic barriers. And there is some controversy surrounding sympatric speciation, primarily related to the speculative nature of it.